Well, once again, I'm Tom Brake, the Director of Unlock Democracy. We are, as hopefully many people on this call will know, an organisation that campaigns for, amongst other things, electoral reform in the UK, but also things like a written constitution. And I'm very pleased that we're able to co-host this event with Make Votes Matter, which again, many of you will be aware of, who campaign specifically on the issue of proportional representation for Westminster, something that we work with them on very closely. So, as I said, we are very, very fortunate to have Professor Sir John Curtice joining us this evening. He is someone who needs no introduction at all, and many of you will have followed his erudite comments on politics over many, many years. And as I said, we're very lucky to have him joining us. And for the purposes of tonight's exchange, I'm going to hand over to Grace, who's going to take us through the session with John tonight. Grace, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everyone. I'm Grace Barnett from Unlock Democracy. So yeah, welcome to this webinar with Professor Sir John Curtice. The format's going to be as follows. So Sir John will start by presenting the findings of the recent British Social Attitudes Survey on Democracy, along with some other research that relates to where British democracy is at right now. We'll then follow up with questions from me and then open it up quite quickly to questions from everyone on the call. If you would like to ask a question, please post it in the Q&A box. If you don't know where that is, for me, it's at the bottom of my Zoom screen. There's a button that says Q&A. So hopefully it's the same for everyone. We've also left the chat open for general conversation. So it's great to see people introducing themselves in there. But if you do have a question, the best chance of getting it answered tonight is to put it directly in the Q&A. So the event's going to last an hour and we'll finish at 7:30. So I will not speak any longer. Over to you, Sir John, for your presentation.
Thank you very much indeed. So let me just very quickly, hopefully, share my screen and then we can fire away, or at least we can if we get the screen in the right place. Right, here we go. Right. So I've been asked to talk in particular on the work that the British Social Attitudes chapter that came out at the back end of last month, which looked more broadly at the state of democracy in Britain, and particularly was doing a bit of an analysis of the state of the two-party system in Britain. But here I'm focusing in particular on another aspect of the chapter, which is people's perceptions of trust and confidence. And it's much discussed that trust and confidence and how we are governed is at an all-time low. So I'm first of all indeed going to look at the trends in trust and confidence. There are three questions that British Social Attitudes has been asking regularly throughout its over 40 years of survey work on political and social attitudes in Britain. And then I'm going to give a little bit of discussion about why some of the reasons as to why trust and confidence are indeed as low as they have been, in particular why they fell once again during the course of the last Parliament. And then I want to come on a little bit to some of the possible consequences, including looking at the impact on electoral reform, how people's levels of trust were reflected in their voting behaviour last year, and also a little bit about turnout. So most of this talk is going to be based on the answers that people have given, both in our most recent survey, which was in the autumn of last year, which in itself was a follow-on from another survey that we did immediately after the election. So sometimes I've therefore got two post-election readings. But it's three questions that BSA has asked regularly. One actually goes all the way back to the Kilbrandon Commission on the future of the Constitution that was set up by Howard Wilson in the late 60s in the wake of the first success by the SNP in Scotland and Plaid indeed in Wales, which then subsequently reported to the then Heath government, and Heath was indeed quite keen on devolution for a while. So that's the first question on here. It says, which of these statements best describes your opinion on the present system of governing Britain? And then there are 4 answers which to go from works extremely well, and basically that's it. It's great, fantastic, you can't do any better, to needs an awful lot of improvement. So there we've got data going all the way back to the early 1970s. There are then 2 more recent questions that British social attitudes primarily developed together with the British election study. One is about the extent to which people trust governments of any party. We try to get people to think about government in general, not the current incumbent government, let alone its partisan colour. And in particular, we asked, do you trust them to place the needs of the nation above the interests of their own political party? And then secondly, perhaps a question whose answer you can probably guess already, how much do you trust politicians, again of any party, to tell the truth when they are in a tight corner? So those are the 3 questions which I'm going to use a great deal throughout the course of this talk. So first of all, the Kilbrandon question, asking people whether or not the system of governing Britain doesn't need much improvement, which is the blue line, and those who think there needs to be quite a lot of improvement, which is the orange line. Now, as you can see, when you go back when Kilbrandon first started, we were basically split 50-50 between those 2 options. We were worried about the state of our government in the early 90s, and that's an era I'll come back to again in a moment. But then in the wake of the advent of New Labour, constitutional reform that Labour pursued, we seemed to think that things were actually not too bad. But as you can see, since then, gradually and persistently, with the first real spike occurring in the wake of the MP's expenses scandal of 2009, the proportion of people who feel that our system of governing needs improvement has basically steadily been increasing. It goes up and down, and not least, elections tend to result both in higher levels of trust and lower levels of concern about how we're being governed. But the thing to note on the far right-hand side is that even after the 2024 election, once we got to the autumn of last year, we were back to a record high proportion of people saying the system of governing Britain needs a great deal of improvement. First of 2 measures of trust. This is the one about trusting government to put nation before party. We reckoned, in the late 1980s, when we first started asking this question, far more people were of the view that, yep, you could expect them to do so, than certainly said they almost never trusted governments. There's an option in between, which I've not shown you here for the purposes of clarity. But basically, the balance of opinion was tilted in the direction of trust. You will see that it falls away in the early 1990s. And early 1990s, of course, is when, in the wake of John Major's Back to Basics speech, the question of sleaze entered the lexicon of our politics. At that point, it was also to do with the fact that some number of Conservative politicians seemed to be sharing a bed with somebody other than their wife. That's no longer an issue. But of course, also cash for questions and other alleged financial improprieties. And this became an issue which dogged the Major government. And it's the point at which basically sleaze and propriety and ethics have been the subject of political controversy and politicization in our politics ever since. You can then also see, once we get with the MP's expenses scandal, we get to again a high level of people saying they almost never trust government, goes to a record high, and it's never really recovered since then. And as you can see, in the wake of the general election itself, very immediately afterwards, there's a bit of an improvement, but we're at 46% of people saying they almost never trust governments to put the nation before party. And thirdly, well, we've never trusted politicians to tell the truth. Rarely have much more than 10% ever said they do so most of the time. But whereas it was around 50% of people saying that they almost never trusted them so to do, the figure is now almost at the 60% mark. So we are at a relative high. And notice, for example, in this last item, and it's also true of the previous ones. Notice how early on in the last Parliament, actually, trust was relatively high. But during the course of the last Parliament, we moved from a position which, at least relative to the decade previously, was somewhere where trust and confidence were relatively high. We saw it fall away quite markedly in the last Parliament, and it's the reasons for that in particular that I will be focusing on. And first, to do so, that takes us to Brexit. Now, this may not be popular with some people in this webinar, but the truth is that the delivery of Brexit was good for trust. Again, if I just go back very quickly to the question on trust in government, you will see again in early 2020, just after Brexit was delivered, we've got an even balance of people saying trust government most of the time and those saying almost never. And it's fallen away sharply during that Parliament. So what's going on here? Well, the truth is that the delivery of Brexit meant that trust in government amongst those who had voted leave was boosted. So notice that in 2020 and in 2021, the orange line, which is the level of trust amongst people who voted leave, is much higher than it was amongst those who voted remain. That actually was a reversal of historical pattern. As you can see for 2016, even just after the referendum, but I can use other data going back further. Historically, the folk who voted Remain, people who were pro-EU, tended always to be more trusting of government. It was the Eurosceptics who were less trusting. The delivery of Brexit reversed that, but the disappointment with Brexit that exists amongst Leave voters has now destroyed that boost, so that we are now back to a world where, frankly, both Remain voters and Leave voters don't have trust. But the failure of Brexit to work out in the way that Leave voters hoped is one of the reasons why trust fell away markedly during the course of the last Parliament. Again, similar pattern, asking people about whether the system of governing Britain needs improvement or not. The Leave voters, once Brexit was delivered, said, oh gosh, actually, it's pretty good. And all of that confidence has now fallen away quite noticeably. But of course, we're also talking about a British state that during the course of the last Parliament began, well, arguably in one instance was already facing the challenge, but in another instance certainly faced a fundamental new challenge, which is the state of the health service. This is data from British social attitudes all the way back to 1983. The blue line are the folk who are satisfied with the health service. The orange line are those who are dissatisfied. Yeah, we were grumbling in the 1990s. New Labour turned that around. And that largely survived a lot of the era of Cameron Osborne's so-called austerity. But once the pandemic was over and people began to realise the length of the waiting lists, satisfaction with the health service has fallen over a cliff. And the truth is that one of the things that lies behind the decline in trust and confidence during the course of the last 5 years is the state of the health service and more broadly the state of our public service. Indeed, that has come to matter more. So if you look, for example, in 2019, the proportion of people who felt that governing Britain needed a great deal of improvement, there wasn't a great deal of difference between those who were satisfied, the blue line, and those who were dissatisfied with the health service. But now there is a clear gap. Those folk who think that are happy with the NHS now also seems to bleed into a wider discontent with the way in which the country is being governed. And again, the same pattern or a similar pattern emerges when you look at trust in government. The folk who are unhappy about the state of the health service are particularly likely to say that they don't trust governments to put the interests of the country first. The other significant crisis facing the British state, this one arguably goes back to the financial crisis of 2008 to 9, but then of course got exacerbated further by COVID, the supply crisis, the Russian-Ukraine war, etc. And that is basically the state of the economy, and particularly as exemplified through the so-called cost of living crisis. This is data from British social studies from shortly after the financial crash, in which people are being asked, how are you coping on your household income? The blue line are those folk who say they were doing so comfortably. The grey line are those who say they are struggling. And as you will see, the blue line fell away during the course of the last Parliament, and the grey line increased. Other economic data show a similar high level of pessimism about the economy during the course of the last Parliament. And as you can see, certainly so far as whether or not the system of governing Britain needs improvement, or whether people trust governments, the folk who are struggling on their income, who are now more numerous, are more likely to lack trust and confidence on at least two of our measures in the way in which the country is being governed. So there are three things. This issue of trust and confidence isn't just to do with political process, although, of course, what I've not talked about, because you can't nail it down with this kind of analysis, but of course is also part of the story, is Partygate and the fact that there was this disjuncture between both, well, how Number 10 interpreted the COVID regulations, but then thereafter the fact that eventually even Tory MPs decided that the relationship between the former Prime Minister and the truth was too loose. And that is also clearly part of the backdrop that we are now at. Okay, so what about consequences of all of this? Well, this is the data going all the way back to 1983 of a question which has historically not been favourable to those who advocate PR in terms of the distribution of responses they get. It essentially says, do you think we should keep the existing electoral system because it provides strong government, or should we change the electoral system in order to allow smaller parties to have a fair share of seats? And that particular wording, there are other wordings available which give a different response. But as you can see, historically, it's tended to produce around 60% of people saying we should keep the current system, and only around a third saying they're in favour. Support for the system particularly peaked in the immediate wake of the 2011 AV referendum, but during thereafter, that was soon reversed. And during the course of the last Parliament, for the first time in 2021, we had a majority of people saying to change the electoral system. The essential movement was occurring amongst folk who were identifying with the Labour Party. The views of Labour supporters changed during the course of last Parliament in a way that they hadn't done to anything like the same degree in the run-up to the 97 election. That pattern has continued, and it has survived the election. Indeed, we are now in a position where now there is majority support on this particular question for electoral reform amongst the voters of all five principal parties across the UK, together with, of course, the nationalist parties in Scotland and Wales. There is now a consensus, a cross-party consensus at the level of the electorate in favour of electoral reform. But how far is this related to trust? And the answer is quite strongly. Here I'm showing you the level of support for changing the electoral system separately according to whether or not you think the system of Britain needs to be, it needs a great deal of improvement, whether you trust governments, etc. And again, the right-hand bars are the folk who are unhappy, and you can see they're much more likely to support changing the electoral system. One thing, however, that is not related to trust and confidence is the introduction of votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. This is not something that is obviously likely to make much difference to the public views towards the way in which the country is governed. Indeed, the idea is not particularly popular. But equally, however, on our evidence, and this is not the first election which has been as true, the oft-claimed argument that low levels of trust depress turnout, it doesn't particularly work. What I'm showing you here are the levels of trust, the levels of turnout broken down by both whether or not people think the system of government needs improving, or whether they trust politicians, or whether they trust government. And you can see there is very little difference in the level of reported turnout. And the position's been much the same at previous elections as well. There are, of course, two things you can do if you're distrustful. One, of course, is exit. The other is to exercise your voice. And I will show you in a moment one of the ways, well, indeed, this might come on to now, it'll show you how indeed people did use voice in order to express their discontent. This is how people voted, broken down by whether or not they trust governments most of the time. Those are the blue bars, or they almost never trust governments. These are the orange bars. And what I invite you to note is the high level of support for reform amongst the people who do not trust the government. And also there is some indication of that as well in the character of support for the Greens. The Labour Party, in contrast, was actually supported by the folk who are relatively happy with the way in which Britain's been governed. Now, some of this almost undoubtedly will be now a reflection of the fact that Labour are in power, but that doesn't seem to be the whole explanation. Equally, perceptions of whether system of government in Britain needs improvement. Again, Reform voters and to a lesser degree, Green support is very noticeably strong amongst those people who think that our system of government needs a great deal of support. So you can see that trust and confidence is almost undoubtedly one of the things, and I can show you lots of other data, that basically Reform voters are the folk who really have given up on at least some of the traditional instruments of British democracy, including the two-party system. So, yep, there are very low levels of trust and confidence. The 2024 election, unlike other previous elections, has done very little to reverse the long-term trend. There was at best only a short-term improvement, which had disappeared by the autumn. Apart from questions of ethics, which have been there and have been in our politics ever since the mid-1990s, more immediately in the last parliament, there are public policy issues, Brexit, the state of our public services, the difficulties of the economy, which are helping to undermine trust and confidence. And yes, Boris Johnson didn't help either. But probably, in terms of where does this make a difference? Well, it's one of the things that's promoting electoral reform. It's one of the things that's promoting reform, but it's probably not the central issue so far as turnout's concerned.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. That was really interesting, and we will be sure to get into it in a lot more detail over the next 30 minutes. So the first question from me is actually one that I've stolen from the Q&A from members. So Deirdre was asking if you could explain a bit more about the sample and scope of the statistics in your presentation, just to get us started.
Sure. So most of the data that I've shown you is from the British Social Attitude Survey, which is an annual high-quality survey that's been conducted by the National Centre for Social Research since 1983. Until the pandemic, it was always done face-to-face with the self-completion supplement, with basically addresses being picked at random from the postcode address file, which is a virtually complete list of all of the addresses in the UK. And then when the interviewers turn up, the computer picks for them a person who lives in that household to be interviewed at random. So it is random sampling, unlike not all opinion polling now. There is some opinion polling that's been done through random sampling methods, but it's a random sample. It was historically face-to-face. The pandemic, of course, made that difficult, and a move that was probably going to happen anyway has now been embedded. So it's now what's called a push-to-web survey. So it's still random sampling. You send letters to addresses saying, "Hi, folks, there's this survey online. You can access it through this website. This is how you do so, etc., etc." And you try to persuade as many people as possible to do it that way. But the crucial thing is it's basically random sampling, and it's done. I mean, in recent years, it's been done September, October each year.
Great, thank you. That's really clear. So the next question from me is, so you've outlined clearly in your presentation that there's a crisis of trust in our politics at the moment. And a lot of people on this call will be interested in that because they're interested in democracy and the health of our democracy. Yeah. But if I was a Labour a person in government right now, and I was thinking about my chances of being re-elected at the next election. Do I need to be worried about this? How do you see this playing out in terms of electoral prospects?
Well, the thing you have to work out is to make sure you don't get caught on the wrong side of the attempt to pursue this issue. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, there are a couple of things to bear in mind. The first is that one of the mistakes that Tony Blair made was to say, we are going to be whiter than white, which of course immediately gives every journalist every excuse to pursue any possible sign of impropriety. And of course, Blair wasn't in government for very long before his relationship between him and the former owner of Formula One became an issue, and he ended up having to plead on television, you know, trust me, read my lips, I'm an honest bloke. But and equally, Starmer, you know, we actually lobbied this whole question of low levels of trust in the middle of the election campaign last time, and Starmer, you know, picked some of it up. But of course, the problem you immediately saw was, so who bought your clothes, Prime Minister? Who bought your wife's clothes? And of course, you know, one of Starmer's weaknesses is he's not a very good politician. So he gives you a lawyer's answer, which is nothing illegal here, mate. Now, that's not the problem. It's politically, it looks bad because you've set yourself up as being right. So one of the things, therefore, politicians have to be very careful about, but they find it very, very difficult to avoid, is to say, we are holier than thou. And just to expand a little bit on a point I alluded to in the presentation, I think basically one of the things that's happened to our politics, and one of the reasons why there is this long-term trend, is that our politicians have come to politicize the question of, are you being ethical or not? So the Labour opposition in the early 90s got an awful lot of mileage out of attacking John Major. Inevitably, therefore, almost inevitably, the Conservative Party were very, very keen to return the compliment. So you then start to see how, when, you know, for example, there was the former health minister whose name I have forgotten, Stephen, whatever he was called. He ended up having to resign over some doubtful ethical issue. And then, of course, in the end, it ended up with the whole MP's expenses scandal. But the point is, what you now find is that if a politician on one side of the aisle is, you know, found to be not filled in their forms for the Electoral Commission properly, or not declared their return properly, etc., the opposition just pile in and say, resign, resign. And I think it's a classic case of individual rationality and collective irrationality, because for politicians as a class to focus on individual behavior and make it a political football is not a way of helping to ensure that the public are going to have confidence in you as a class, which is one of the reasons why I take the view that tightening the regulation of politics isn't necessarily going to help at all. Because when you tighten the regulation in politics, what you end up doing is creating tripwires for people to fall over.
Sure, yeah. On the other hand, would you say a lot of a common perception of politicians is that they get away with everything, they're never held accountable,
Sure.
and they're different views. So how can we get that balance between showing that politicians are accountable and are held to high ethical?
Well, I mean, part of my answer to Grace is this: is that would it be true that my politicians were more accountable for their policy failures and less accountable for their personal failures? But if you kind of go through the history of resignations, they're dominated by allegations of personal failure. But how many politicians have resigned because the policy they pursued has been a failure?
Sure, yeah.
And I think that's where our accountability is lacking. We are focusing on individual behavior. And for reasons, of course, the point is, individual behavior failure is easy to dramatize. It has human interest. There is a fairly easy train of cause and effect. Whereas policy failure is much bigger, takes much longer to demonstrate, and of course is the line of cause and effect is much greater. But at the end of the day, policy failure costs this country much more than does personal failure.
Sure. Thank you. So that brings me nicely onto a question from Jill, who's in the audience. She asked how, hang on, I just need to find it. Yeah. So we're talking a lot about lack of trust in the political class, but I was thinking, is there also a crisis of trust in sort of authority figures and institutions more broadly? And Jill asked, how does the UK public feel about fairness in terms of taxation? And she uses the example of the perception that the super rich all live in tax havens and dodge tax and so on.
Can you remind me the first point you made? Sorry,
I was just wondering if this declining trust in politicians is part of a broader decline in trust in institutions.
Well, short answer, it's certainly not associated with a decline in interpersonal trust. You ask people whether or not you trust other people or not, the proportion of people who say they do, it doesn't show any great long-term trend. We know it's only around 50% or so, but it's there's no great long-term trend. There are some institutions which are definitely trusted much less than they once were. Indeed, I think the biggest turnaround in British social attitudes in its 40 years of history is that in the 1980s, 90% of us trusted banks. And in the immediate wake of the financial crash, only 10% of us did so. Whereas in contrast, trade unions, which used to be very heavily distrusted, they're still not highly trusted, but they're more trusted than they were. University professors are still trusted. Journalists are not. It's difficult I think, to argue that there is, I mean, particular institutions lose trust for particular reasons. That you can certainly see. But I think it's much more difficult to say that there is a generalized sense of distrust. And to that extent, at least, the fact that we are now less trusting of politicians in government is probably the product of causes closer to home rather than. I mean, I think what one always feels about trust and confidence, of course, is that. I mean, again, you said we should hold people accountable. Well, look, you hold people. If you want to hold people accountable, you are to some degree always going to withhold a degree of trust, right? And that one of the things about trust is that, well, actually, the reasons why we want relatively high levels of trust are basically because if we don't have high levels of trust, it's very difficult for the state to get compliance with what it wants people to do, and that's particularly concerned during the COVID pandemic. Or if it does, it has to use very heavy bureaucratic procedures, various degrees of force and incarceration, right? Which is just economically bad news. But on the other hand, given that the state claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence, and therefore is invested with potentially very important powers and also taking away people's liberty, we also don't want people to trust the state too much, because we want them to some degree to be willing to say at times, hang on, you've got this right with the exercise of this absolutely fundamental power. So I'm always slightly wary about people saying, oh, look, there's this terrible trust in confidence, because the truth is we don't necessarily, in a democracy, we want a degree of trust for the state to be able to function, but we don't want so much trust that they're not willing to hold the state accountable.
Sure. Great. Thank you for that. Thinking on the point you made in your presentation about how the people who have the lowest trust in the current system were that those people are strongly represented among reform supporters, as in Reform UK supporters, and to a lesser extent the Green Party. So these challenger parties are doing well out of this crisis in trust. But to what extent would you say that is because they have not yet had the chance to disappoint people in office, and there is a limit to their success as they are exposed more to the publicity that comes with being in office and having to deliver?
Well, that, of course, is one of the challenges that faces reform in the wake of their success in the county council elections, and may face them further after next year's local and devolved elections. But I think the crucial point, I mean, the crucial message that came out of the 2024 election was anybody but the Tories, right? The one thing the electorate want to do. So you're talking about a party which is now the principal opposition party, whose reputation, whose brand has been seriously damaged by the last 5 years. It was dealt a bad hand, but it played it very, very badly. But the Labour government, Labour were elected despite a lack of enthusiasm rather than because of an obvious high degree of enthusiasm. It's a record low share of the vote. People did not know what Labour stood for. Starmer has never been popular. So there was always a question staring you in the face after the 2024 election. So if Labour can't indeed turn things around fairly quickly, and some of us were kind of skeptical about the degree of optimism that Labour were expressing during the election campaign, if they can't turn it around fairly quickly, well, where are those votes going to go? Well, they're not going to go to the Tories. And the question is, do they go to the Dems, do they go to the Greens, or do they go to the Reform? Well, the answer has been, well, actually, it's been all three of those. But the fact that the Tory party's been, I mean, a lot of the support for Reform, even now, is still coming off the Conservative Party, who's, in which people have no confidence at all. But it was always clear that there was an opening for a serious challenge to the two-party system in the wake of the outcome of the 24 election. And it happens to be the case that Farage, partly by eating into the Labour vote, but only partly eating the Labour vote, but by basically now sucking not just voters, but people and money from the Conservative Party. I mean, he's open. His objective, his openly stated objective is to replace the Conservative Party as the principal party of the right, and so far he's succeeding.
Sure, thank you for that.
But we are talking about a group of deeply discontented voters. And the point you have to understand about Farage, we can argue about whether he's got solutions, but Farage is absolutely brilliant at articulating the concerns of a particular section of the electorate. He's brilliant at it.
Sure, that's true. So one more question from me, and that is about the finding of the BSA 2025 survey about the two-party system and the fragmentation of the vote.
Yes.
Is the two-party system over for good? Can you see it, is it going through a transitional phase and it's going to reemerge looking somewhat different, but still two parties? Can we possibly know?
Well, we can't. I think all we can do is to diagnose where we're at, and I think, as I've already indicated, I think the question that was, I mean, despite Labour's majority of 174, the fundamental question that was left hanging by the 2024 election was, were we beginning to see the beginning of the end of the traditional Conservative Labour dominance of our politics? Now, of course, the first thing immediately anybody can say, well, look, we've been here before. The SDP Liberal Alliance, late 1981, early 1982. To some degree, even the, I agree with Nick phenomenon during the course of the 2010 election campaign. Or indeed, as people tend to forget, the relatively high standing of the Brexit Party and the Liberal Democrats collectively in the spring of 2019. However, I think there are certain, I would certainly point to two fundamental qualitative reasons as to why where we're at now is probably more of a challenge. The first is a little too noticed feature of the 2024 election, which is that it was the first election in British electoral history at which 5 political parties fought virtually everywhere for the first time. We had 4 in 2015. This time we've got 5. And of course, one of the crucial things that Reform are doing is they're now creating a party organization. And they were very, very successful in the county council elections in finding people to stand. Once you've created a party organization, you are much more likely to survive. As I put it, one of the reasons why the Liberal Democrats survived the electoral fallout from the coalition is at least there was still one man, one woman, and a dog willing to put up a Liberal Democrat candidate everywhere during the darkest days. The Greens have a party organization pretty much everywhere, right? So that's not something that is, and so the fundamental failure of the Eurosceptic movement hitherto has been that failure to create that permanent organization. We're looking to see whether reform do it. So that's thing number one. The other thing is that despite Labour's attempt to reconnect with working class voters, no discernible progress at all in the last parliament. So therefore, we are in a world still where the link between that historic link in British voting behaviour between social class and voting Conservative or Labour, it's still not there. There is no relationship at all. The party that relatively speaking, is most successful amongst working class voters is Reform, and if any party is relatively popular amongst middle class voters, it's the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, right? And this is a completely, and so therefore the traditional anchors of the two-party system, the traditional demographic anchor, it isn't there anymore. And arguably that's one of the reasons, because in the end, I mean, essentially what Nigel Farage has done is he's been able to take that relatively new coalition of voters that Boris Johnson put together in 2019 and gave him victory, which was essentially a group of pro-Leave voters. Nigel Farage has taken that coalition away from the Tories. Support for the Tories amongst Leave voters is now barely any higher than it was amongst Remain voters. It is Reform. Support for Reform is at 50% amongst Leave voters. They have basically taken the Johnsonian coalition. But the point is, because the Conservatives had a very different coalition in 2019, they've not been able to keep it. So they're anchorless. They have neither their new coalition or their old coalition. And Labour equally, the Labour, I mean, again, it's worth remembering, where is Labour's core vote now? It's amongst young middle-class professionals living in London. London is the part of the UK where Labour's vote was highest at the last general election. This is so we are the traditional foundations of Conservative and Labour politics are not there. Now, there's no guarantee as to where all this will fall out, and it may just be that Reform replace the Tories, for example. But it is a pretty fundamental change. And I think the other thing which is now very clearly changed, and why Labour are finding it difficult, is that neither Conservative nor Labour now can assume that there are no enemies to the left and no enemies to their right. Irrespective of Corbyn, which I've seen going across in the chat, the Greens have already been taking voters to the left of the Labour Party amongst the very socially liberal voters. It was very clear, particularly amongst younger voters, the last election. And of course, Reform are just taking votes off the Tories in spades. So I think these are the reasons why we are in a different world than before, and why this, and certainly now if Reform are ahead in the polls for at least another month or two, it will be the longest period of time in which a party other than Conservative or Labour has been ahead in the opinion polls.
Yeah, most definitely. We're going to now get out of Westminster with some questions about the devolved governments. There are two which I'm going to tie together. One is from George. He asks if there's a notable difference in levels of public trust towards devolved governments versus the government in Westminster. And he suggests that if so, that could be linked to their different approaches to COVID. And another question was about Scottish independence. Do you think it will ever happen? That's from Daniel, and he says the answer will help him with his homework for his politics higher paper. So,
okay, right. It's a while since we have asked in Scotland. There's a separate Scottish social justice survey. It's a while since we've asked in Scotland the questions that I've been using from the British social justice survey, What we have asked, however, really going all the way back to the advent of devolution, is to ask people the extent to which they trust the UK government to do various things, and the extent to which they trust the Scottish government to do various things. And the truth is, it's still the case that there is what some people at trade call a halo effect. The Scottish government is always, there is a higher level of trust in Scotland in the Scottish government than there is in the UK government. That's persistent. It's hardly surprising, but it's very, very clearly there. And even though at the moment we are in a position where basically both the UK government and the Scottish government, in terms of their policy performance, are relatively unpopular north of the border, the Scottish government still comes out rather better than the UK government. So I think the point there is that because you've got a set of political institutions that are the closest thing to recognizing the distinct nationality that people in Scotland feel, the issue of trust is a somewhat different one. Scots independence, well, is it ever going to happen? Well, we're still in a world where nearly 50% of people want to leave the Union. The issue's not gone away. Will it happen? Well, it will. It will. The two things that now matter are the outcome. The outcome of the 2026 Holyrood election, whether or not there is still a pro-independence majority after the election, and that is very much looking 50-50. Because if there isn't a majority at Holyrood, there won't be an independence referendum for another 5 years, because you've got to get a majority at Holyrood. Then the question is what happens in 2029, and the crucial thing is whether or not we find ourselves in a situation where the SNP have leverage in a hung parliament. And I've always taken the view that both another referendum on changing the electoral system and another referendum on Scottish independence lie in the hands of a hung parliament, and whether or not we find ourselves in a situation that Cameron found himself in 2010 is, despite the public rhetoric, if you don't do the deal, you're out on your ear. That said, of course, one of the interesting things about that is that the sequencing could be crucial. Under the current electoral system, the SNP are much more likely to have leverage at Westminster than if we switch to PR. Under PR, it's going to be much more difficult for the SNP ever to get leverage at Westminster. So if we have PR first, then the ability of the SNP to foist another independence referendum on Westminster becomes much more difficult. But I mean, all of that said, I think there is now a realization inside the nationalist movement that basically they need to get the numbers in support of independence up above 50%, and that basically, you should really only hold referendums when you know what the answer is going to be. And at the moment, nobody knows what the answer would be. I mean, the other thing, of course, to realise, it's also tied up with Brexit. The reason why support for independence is as high as it is now in Scotland is that people who want to be inside the EU are in favour of independence, and the folk who are happy being outside the EU are not. And that's a change from 10 years ago. Thank you.
So we've got 10 minutes to go, so I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more rounds. The first one, or the first round, is about money in politics. So lots of people are asking about this in the chat off the back of Labour's announced reforms this month. What is the state of public opinion regarding money in politics? Are they sceptical of the influence of big donors? Do they support a cap on donations? And people are asking also about state funding. Is that in any way popular as a proposal?
It's a long time since anybody's asked about state funding. Short answer to your question is the public don't like paying for politicians, but equally they don't like it if other people pay for them as well. Okay, I mean, it's spending money on politics and political parties and increasing MP salaries and all the rest of it. It's never popular. The MP's expenses scandal then showed the mess into which you can get into as a result. but you know, to be honest, is there a particular concern about well, the issue of whether the minister is going to take their redundancy money is always raised when somebody resigns for, you know, a personal issue. It's not going to transform people's views of how the country is being run. Okay. And it creates yet another potential political football, because people will say, "Oh, you're going to take the money. You're going to take the money."
Right.
Could
Yeah.
do, right? So,
So carry on.
so you know, it's not clear to me that it's going to do any particular any particular advantage. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, I think the point about my talk is that if you want to get the public's confidence back in the way in which this country is governed, you've got to improve the country's performance on the crucial substantive measures. You're talking about a society where too many people say to themselves, A, am I going to be able to feed my kids tonight? And B, if I fall ill, will I be able to get health care speedily enough? Those are two fundamental existential questions that far too many people face at the moment. And until we can turn that around, we are going to doubt. I mean, I think there is frankly a doubt about the capacity of the British state to deliver.
Sure. Yeah. So this might be the last question, but we might be able to squeeze one more in afterwards. This is a follow-up on what we were talking about around voter fragmentation a few minutes ago. So you said that we're in a different world than before. So given that statement, what are the arguments for first past the post? And would the alternatives help us to get out of this situation where elections are not restoring trust? Take it away.
Yeah, okay, right, fine. So I'm a long-standing critic of the single-member party electoral system, but that's because I am doubtful about the merits of an electoral system where the relationship between seats and votes is a function of the geography of support, the importance of which was completely and dramatically demonstrated in 2024. All right. The Labour Party now has this incredibly geographically evenly spread vote, as do the Conservatives. For Labour, that's good news. For the Tories, it's bad news. The Democrats now have this remarkably geographically concentrated vote for the first time in their lives. And as a third party, that is good news. But this is all to do with geography, right? I think there is an argument in favour of majoritarian electoral systems, but they need to be systematically majoritarian, e.g. Italy, e.g. Greece, whereby you basically guarantee whoever wins either a majority or a large chunk of seats, which probably helps to ensure that they get a majority, right? There's a perfectly reasonable intellectual argument in favour of that. It, of course, becomes more difficult to sustain that, however, if your electoral politics becomes more fragmented and you are, you know, winners are at 30, 34, 35%. I mean, any kind of majoritarian system begins to look more questionable at that kind of level. Would I necessarily expect that trust to suddenly rebound if we change the electoral system? To be honest, no. Just bear in mind, it would depend on the character. It depends on whether or not what emerges out of election coming out of PR is whether you can get a system of stable government. Now, that's not impossible. All right. Okay. But, you know, we also know from people's reactions to the Brexit impasse in Parliament in 2019 is that people don't like it if they think that basically nothing is capable of getting done because Parliament votes down all possible options. All right. Again, it comes back to performance. There's a little bit of evidence to suggest that PR systems are associated with slightly higher levels of trust, but it's not to be, the pudding's not to be over-egged.
Sure, yeah. Stability and delivery seem to be coming out on top tonight. So that we actually do have time for one more question, which links in quite nicely talking about other countries. So John asks that most of the analysis tonight has been founded on domestic evidence.
Sure.
Do we have any data from other countries that tells us is the UK alone in this predicament? What can we learn from other liberal?
Well, the UK is not alone in the predicaments that underlie the challenge of trust and confidence, and it's not unique in seeing the rise of challenger parties. Indeed, actually, the UK has hitherto been unique in virtually all of the countries of what we used to call Western Europe before the fall of the Berlin Wall, in still actually having the same party system. Virtually everywhere else, it's changed, right? And the challenger parties have become crucial parts of the fabric. I mean, even Macron, right? Completely new party he founded, right? Being opposed by another relatively upstart challenger party in the form of Madame Le Pen. Germany, the rise of the right, but its politics has been fragmented for years. Britain seemed to stand out as the one place where it didn't, and the electoral system seemed to be able to insulate it against these things. Now that no longer seems to be the case. But what underlies these things? Well, it's the impact of globalization, and the impact and the way in which the globalization of the banking system led to the banking crisis, the way in which globalization has helped to produce migratory flows that societies are struggling to deal with, the way that globalization and the change in the character of the labor market means that if you don't succeed in the educational achievement ladder, it's much more difficult to achieve advancement in terms of occupations. These are all fundamental social changes that creates sections of our society that don't have qualifications, who are not able to take advantage of migration, and they feel disadvantaged as a result. And where, broadly speaking, advanced industrial economies have been struggling to achieve fairly standard levels of economic growth ever since 2010. To that extent, at least, there is a challenge to all states to be able to deliver what the public are looking for against a pretty challenging policy environment. And some of that then gets reflected in both the populism of the right, but also the populism of the left.
Sure. Right. Thank you. Thank you for that. So we've got 1 minute to go now. So I'm going to end now by saying thank you very much, Sir John Curtice, for joining us tonight. It's been a wide-ranging discussion. We've all learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone is going to go away with much to think about. Thank you to everyone on the call who stayed with us throughout. I can see that the numbers were one of the highest ever for a webinar that we've hosted. If you want to support our work putting on webinars like this in the future, please do join Unlock Democracy or Make Votes Matter. The video for this is going to be available online on YouTube later in the week, so you can watch back any bits that you missed. I think that's all I have to say in terms of wrapping up, but then just thank you again to Sir John, and we'll see you all at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Many thanks. Bye.